In the previous conversation, we predicted the events a little, namely Orban's visit to China even before it became known. And I, in principle, suggest that we follow the same scenario and predict the subsequent events of what is happening now. It's no secret that recently there has been more talk about the end of the war, including with the speech of our president. All this is heard today, and this is complemented by news from China, among other things. I will also implement here the news that was heard from Mr. Sysky, that it is possible to return Crimea. And I would like to consider all this in the context of what kind of peace is possible. Because today Wang Yi, this is the Ministry of Health of the People's Republic of China, also said that they, in principle, can be a mediator in this conversation. And if you watch and listen carefully to our president, he says that, in principle, we do not care with whom we talk, even with partners who can sit Russia, even with Russia itself. But here, I think, the emphasis is on partners. And so, you know, it all comes down to China. The structure is interesting, because all this time the United States, our partners have been fighting very hard. Trying, fighting, trying, and in the end, China may even come out of the back position and say, I will help do all this now. It is absolutely not a problem. So, from the point of view of understanding, what is not a problem? Is Putin ready to make concessions, and what are these concessions? Is he ready to give up Crimea?
Look, there are two aspects to the negotiation process. The first person who can bring Moscow into negotiations without any conditions, be it preconditions on the part of Ukraine or Moscow, and voice their conditions, should sit down at the negotiating table. In principle, if the subject of negotiations is a ceasefire, perhaps an extension of the truce or an agreement in principle on war and peace, China probably has such an opportunity. Exactly, I emphasize, only to sit down at the negotiating table. This is not about the content of the negotiations, but you remove the preconditions. After all, there was a condition on the part of Ukraine, which means that by the decision of the National Security and Defense Council with Putin, not to sit down at the negotiating table. Now President Zelensky has already spoken. Well, in principle, it can be overcome, yes, so to speak. Well, since this is the case, everyone wants peace, the National Security and Defense Council may make another decision. Well, the situation has changed, please, no questions. And the second condition, I remind you, was that an important aspect was that Moscow must still liberate part of the occupied territories and so on. This was a precondition at one time. Now this condition may also have been postponed, not filmed, but pushed aside. On the eve of the Swiss summit near Lucerne, Moscow, represented by Putin, announced 3 conditions for the start of such negotiations. This is the liberation of territories in the unoccupied part of the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk regions from the armed forces of Ukraine. In general, the formations of the armed forces of Ukraine must withdraw from them, that is, actually give this territory to Russia. The second condition is to lift all sanctions. The third is the non-aligned status of Ukraine. Under these 3 conditions, negotiations can begin. This is what Putin said, and he stipulated that this is final, not intermediate, and so on and so forth. And can China sit Moscow down for 100 negotiations with Ukraine without these preconditions? With the participation of individual guarantors, without the participation of guarantors? Well, I think China probably has such opportunities. There is probably an opportunity to sit Moscow down for 100 negotiations. Will it be Putin personally? Will it be Lavrov? This is where the options begin. In Istanbul, for example, there were representatives of Russia and Ukraine. Let me remind you that the delegation was headed by Medinsky, Putin's assistant in the presidential administration. The person is not the most influential, to put it mildly, especially in the Ukrainian issue. He himself, by the way, is also from Ukraine, it's just that many may not know. And the second person is Arakhamia, who formally leads the faction in parliament, and other officials were also present. That is, the status was, in principle, sufficient for representatives to discuss military peace issues. The second aspect concerns what the talks should be about, what they should be based on. But here, in my opinion, from my personal point of view, no one can influence. If we are talking about Russia, then no one can influence it, and China included, decisively, definitely not, portray anything and so on. After all, what will Moscow come to such negotiations with without preconditions? Agree with the fact of the occupation of part of the territory of Ukraine, about 20%, and recognize that these are the subjects of the Russian Federation. Well, perhaps they are ready to discuss which parts of the still unoccupied territory can be moved back and forth. For Ukraine, this is, let's say, unacceptable for public opinion and the people of Ukraine. You can discuss some things, but there is no relationship with other issues. Moscow does not want to link, for example, the unoccupied part of Ukraine, which is 80% of the territory, which should have the right to unlimited sovereignty, without any restrictions. This is where Moscow is fundamentally not ready to talk, because unlimited sovereignty implies, in the end, joining the North Atlantic Alliance and the EU. So when China, which has an interest in this issue, given the strategic importance of Taiwan and the possibility of its integration into mainland China, discusses the situation, it is also interested in special conditions for itself in Europe and possibly in America, including the lifting of the restrictions imposed by America on China. These are some of China's opportunities in the Southeast Asian region. For example, maintaining the status quo, in which only China and North Korea possess nuclear weapons, and their severe proliferation in Southeast Asia is impossible. Neither Japan, nor Taiwan, nor South Korea should possess nuclear weapons. It is the United States that must guarantee this. There are also parallel interests regarding the impossibility of developing the Military Strategic Association AUKUS, including the Anglo-Saxon rings of 5 states. These are the United States, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So China's direct interest is obvious, and the question is whether Ukraine's Western partners, in fact the collective West, are ready to follow this, since the demands are too ambitious and so on. When talking about negotiations and the possibility of inviting to them, the first aspect is considered first of all, and they can persuade to hold 100 negotiations, choose a platform where either official representatives of Ukraine and Russia, or, possibly, top officials, can meet. Could be. And here is the second aspect, which I mentioned above, but it does not yet see any possibility of resolution, you see, because there are things that Moscow will not give up. And you know, even in terms of territory, it can still move somewhere, back and forth, both the front line and the territories potentially bitten off by it. But on the issue of the future of Ukraine, its sovereignty and the implementation of Western integration, including joining alliances, Moscow will not refuse. Therefore, today, China, selling exclusive relations with Moscow, acts as a mentor in relation to Moscow. He can persuade it to participate in the formats that Beijing itself initiates. The format, I mean peace talks. What is Washington doing? Probably, the Biden administration could still somehow, without desire, but discuss such a structure, could. Still with a negative decision, but they could. Why should China deal with the issues of the settled? What does China have to do with Europe? Well, there have always been reasonable statements that China is just a regional power and should not claim a global role comparable to America. As for Trump, he generally said, I don't need anyone at all, I will personally decide everything with Putin. He does not need China, Orban, Saudi Arabia, or the Swiss format. What for, if he says that he will solve everything within 24 hours? I understand that this sounds eccentric and presumptuous, but he really believes that he can solve all the issues directly and personally. He does not need assistants, intermediaries, contradictory or direct allies. By and large, he doesn't even need Kiev. He will come to an agreement with Putin, and then he will convince Kiev that this is a working structure. I believe that he will not come to an agreement with Putin. I believe that he will bury himself in Putin's reluctance to get apart. He will want everything. Trump might suggest to him, as a developer, to say, well, you're already at 20%, so maybe that's a great cutoff line. And everything else is not, everything else goes to the West forever, including the North Atlantic Alliance, NATO, the EU and the entire set that we understand by this. Putin will not agree with this, and this will be a problem. Today, China is just a player in this field. He is not a significant protagonist of Moscow's interests, and he is satisfied with Moscow in its current form. China has a direct interest in Moscow and Russia, while China shows less interest in Ukraine. Conflict with Ukraine, enter into some kind of tight alliance with Moscow in order to destroy Ukraine. Well, China doesn't need it. For China, this is how it is. Space, interests, expansions, which may be aimed at Eastern Siberia, the Far East, Transbaikalia, and so on, all of Russian Asia. Why meddle in Ukraine? By and large, there is no need to help Moscow win this war either. But you don't have to lose. Therefore, the peaceful option on such terms suits China, because it understands that the second aspect, which I mentioned above, is difficult to achieve. China wants to capitalize on the first issue and realize its interest at this stage by bringing Moscow to the negotiating table without any preconditions. For the fact that we will sit Moscow down at the negotiating table without preconditions, give us something. We want to get something. We want to obtain exclusive special status as a country engaged in a peacekeeping mission and mediation in such a complex issue in Europe. We want to get what is ours right now, and no one is ready to give it to us, you know? China is always pursuing its own interests. Yes, he has them. Yes, they are obvious. And so, from my point of view, for the time being, all this will look exclusively like such manipulations, you see. In reality, there is nothing behind it yet. Moreover, I repeat, Washington has not officially spoken out about all these endless initiatives that are being discussed here, and in other places. Let me remind you that Erdogan and the Istanbul platform are always open. Erdogan is always there. It is proposed to resume all these formats, following the example of the grain deal and other similar ones. Orban's initiative, where he seems to take on the mission of a mediator, but the advantage is that he, we understand, is an agent of Moscow, but in fact, well, as it were, a person who is not interested. There is no direct interest in territorial and other disputes regarding Ukraine. There is an initiative of GIVE of Saudi Arabia. You remember the conference on August 5, 2023, which took place, and they are going to hold the next conference. There is the Swiss format for the peace formula, the summit recently held near Lucerne at the end of June, which also claims to be a kind of mediator and a world platform for resolving the war in Ukraine. All this is a large set, but also China, which has advocated a conference under its auspices, held, apparently, in Beijing. A peace conference with the participation of Moscow, mandatory participation. That's all. Well, there are other, smaller initiatives, but in this case, China really has a lot of influence power, simply because it can get Moscow to participate in it. That's all.
This means that we conclude that we will see the next, conditionally, peace summit in China.
There is a chance of this if two important players, two important participants, agree to it. In fact, official Kiev, most likely, with a high degree of probability, can do this, having removed some preconditions, in particular, that they do not communicate with Putin, as indicated in the decision of the National Security and Defense Council after all the well-known events related to the termination of the format of negotiations in February-March 2022 in Istanbul. The United States remains. There is a certain unpredictability with the United States, since the country does not yet have a president. Who will it be? Will it be Kamala Harris who will follow Joe Biden's course? Or will it be Trump who is changing course? It fundamentally changes. That is, to say that it will continue in the main, but the details will be different? Well, no. Well, of course not. Trump certainly sees the solution to all these issues differently and relies on him to do what Biden did, but the hope is faint. He will fundamentally change this position. In which direction, it is definitely impossible to answer. Until these two sides speak out, Beijing's initiative will not receive support. I think that most likely the United States will not support Beijing's initiative. This is my opinion.
Okay, well, an interesting structure is being built here, where China is present with this initiative, the United States. We will discuss this later. 3.2 thousand people are now watching us live, so, friends, please write where you are from. As always, we traditionally remember, read, and it is also very interesting. Therefore, please write. After all, if we talk about the same Trump, who speaks quite compassionately about the fact that he wants to end these deaths of people, that he wants to stop the entire war. Did anything prevent him from doing anything at all in this regard?
Well, no. The point is not that he could or could not do it. After all, you need to do such things from the post of president. He, let's say, maneuvered in this matter. Recall that he influenced his protege, the head of the House of Representatives of Congress Johnson, who until some well-known moment blocked aid to Ukraine. That is, they did not agree. They set conditions. Let's build a wall for migrants. Remember, there has been so much there since January. Nevertheless, the issue was voted on and aid in the amount of 61 billion was allocated to Ukraine. So could Trump have done more? Well, probably. He could influence some group of his supporters directly in the House of Representatives of the US Congress. However, he can always say that Biden determined policy. He is the president, not me. Why are you me? I'm just an opposition figure trying to get a top job in the Oval Office of the White House. Therefore, blaming me is not quite justified. Therefore, from this point of view, Trump can always hide behind the fact that first he needs to get the first position, and then he will be able to influence something. What he is talking about suggests a plan. In Time magazine, two of his advisors, two generals, voiced the theses of the plan for Ukraine, which have already been discussed. This did not add clarity, since it is said that conditions will be put forward to Ukraine, depending on its position on negotiations and arms supplies. That is, roughly speaking, it does not refuse. This means that supplies can stop. If they agree, supplies will continue. And the second condition related to it is that any negotiations in which Ukraine enters should not make decisions without the consent of Ukraine. Sounds great? Sounds great. That is, if Ukraine does not agree to give up 20% of the territory, the war continues. You see, behind all this rhetoric of a ceasefire, it is necessary to stop the war and so on, there is a very lame, very great danger. It lies in the fact that in such a construction, victims and aggressors seem to become the same. That is, it turns out that Moscow bears full responsibility for its actions, since Ukraine did not attack Moscow and did not invade Rostov, Kursk, Bryansk and other cities. This was done by the Russian Federation. But who did it? And here there is no such statement. Based on this, it seems that there is some kind of conflict, from something they took and began to fight two peoples, two countries. But if this statement is not there, and you will be told, well, this is natural, we will put it on the back burner so as not to tear up Moscow, so that the main war will take place, and then we will figure it out. We hear all this, of course, we hear. The fact is that in such a situation, it is impossible to find a settlement. If you do not recognize who unleashed the war and who is responsible. Why? Because then, it turns out, they seem to be arguing for some disputed territories, like Donbass, like Kherson, Zaporizhia regions. Disputed territories? So let's find a compromise. But they are not controversial. Legally, these territories belong to Ukraine. Moscow is not going to recognize this important fact. He is not going to. He denies it. Moscow, even in its constitution, enshrined a provision according to which those agreements and obligations that contradict its national interests will not be fulfilled. This provision was amended in the constitution on July 1, 2020. They are not considered mandatory for Russia. Previously, the situation sounded different, but the norms of international law and the obligations associated with them are of dominant importance in relation to national legislation and legal requirements. And now Moscow can deny these things under its own constitution. Its national interest is considered paramount. Well, the way they understand them. Aggressive national interest. Therefore, the game here is that if Trump proceeds from the fact that we will talk about it and have decided everything, then he will not decide. Understand? It won't, because when there are two sides, and he represents the side of Ukraine, and it is necessary to somehow diverge corners without scratching each other, there is little chance of success. There is very little chance. But if there is a statement that, yes, Moscow started this war of aggression and illegally occupied the territory, but at the same time we want to end the conflict, let's proceed from these two theses. The desire to end the conflict and Moscow's guilt. Moscow cannot claim anything more than the international community can be offered to the aggressor for the sake of its satisfaction. That is, conditionally, yes, nothing can be done with Moscow, it has nuclear weapons. Okay, the international community responds to this that any decisions on compromises must involve the preservation of Ukraine's sovereignty. Even if it is through territorial concessions. But the rest of Ukraine itself must retain the right to choose its own destiny. It should move to the west, stay at home, move east. It is up to Ukraine, the Ukrainian citizens themselves, to decide. This is the main thesis. Territorial too. But I emphasize once again that to give up sovereignty for the sake of territory is to lose both territory and sovereignty.
In such cases, a conflict occurs in life. The fight is already going on, both sides have enough bruises on each other. Nobody wants to give in, and in this situation, we are probably in a better position, because we are ready to talk. Volodymyr Zelensky projects this position, that is, we are ready for negotiations. If we refer to your words, then you say that Putin resists with his horn, does not want this, does not want everything, wants everything at once. He wants Ukraine not to join NATO, he wants territory, he wants this, he wants that. But the West does not work like that. It will say, well, buddy, come on, we need to move. And in this fight, in this conflict, which is described above, there must be a turning point. So, there is a high probability that the Americans, perhaps Trump, if he comes, after talking to Putin, can offer the following: okay, let's do this, we will provide weapons, allow Ukraine to reach the borders of Crimea, and then call back again and ask, well, are you ready to talk about something?
Well, I think so. I think so. Why? Because, you see, Trump needs to make sure not only himself, perhaps his advisors and he himself understand that Putin is incapable of negotiating. Although he says one thing while projecting another, he wants to become president again. Therefore, he needs to make sure that he is the only one who can solve everything. But, in principle, everyone realizes that he and Putin decided something, although little was solved in his first term from 2016 to 2020, when there was no war. That is, there was no war then. Now the situation is fundamentally different. But the situation is fundamentally different. That is, it is one thing to negotiate when you have not yet seized Ukraine, and another when Putin is already eating Ukraine and saying, and now bring everything back. If he suddenly publicly sees Putin's inability to negotiate, and not only him, everyone will see that they met and did not agree on anything. Well, then I'm sorry, then we really have to provide it with everything that Ukraine demands. Do you want war? Well, let the war then be according to other rules, not the way you planned it. Beat a lying person. Let's lift this lying man, shake him off, give him a ketman in his hands, and let him? And then let's see how you sing in another situation, when something like this begins to fall off in you. You will experience all kinds of problems, more significant. Yes, this is a logical move. Very logical. We offered you, you didn't want to, well, what to do now? This is a logical move. Most likely, it is possible to predict just such a course of events, because, I repeat, I do not believe that Trump is some kind of pure agent of Moscow, ready to simply surrender everything. Perhaps he is ready to surrender, but there is no price that Moscow is ready and able to pay for such a surrender. There is no such price, it does not exist. Understand? And therefore, yes, we can count on the fact that Trump, having come to power, this degree of responsibility is already different. It's one thing to talk when you're a candidate and a former president under the scrutiny of the US justice system, and it's another thing to be responsible for the country. And they don't joke there. Listen, they shoot those who stand out too much. Therefore, there is a complex structure of relations within the American establishment, and Trump will have to answer for his words on a different level and at a different cost for himself. Therefore, yes, it cannot be ruled out if Trump wins the election, and if after this election, after the inauguration on January 20, 2025, he goes to meet with Putin, I don't know, in Helsinki, in Geneva, where they will meet there, see, and everyone will see that Putin is not ready, is not going to, will not agree on. He can say, I tried, I proposed. Perhaps it will be so. Many people are counting on this. One of those experts whom I see, read, listen to, discuss with them. That's what they're talking about, and they're more Trump supporters. I am neutral about both Trump and Kamala Harris. For me, the criteria are their attitude towards Russia, Ukraine and the war, respectively. And I don't make a preference for labor migration, illegal migration, all these problems within the Americans. This should be of interest to American voters. They must decide what is an important priority for them. For me, the priority is international issues related to the war between Russia and Ukraine, and everything else is up to the taste, as they say, of the American voters themselves. They vote, I vote.
Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but projecting such a situation, can Ukraine in this case, as we have discussed, be fascinated by this success and say that no, we will move on? I recall the words of Ben Hodges, who said that after the Kherson and Kharkiv operations, Ukraine should have used its powerful positions in the negotiations. However, they abandoned this after seeing the effectiveness on the battlefield.
You know, I remember well the situation that accompanied September and November. In September 2022, almost 11 to 12,000 square kilometers in the Kharkiv region were liberated, when cities and settlements in this region were liberated for a week and a half in a row. I also remember the further continuation of the effective actions of the armed forces of Ukraine along the Dnieper on the right bank, along the Dnipro district. We discussed all this in detail, including the evacuation, which I call, of Russian troops from the right bank of Kherson. I saw all this with my own eyes, I observed. It seems to me that it was not so much Ukraine that did not agree to negotiations or slowed down the process somewhere. It seems to me that the West did not behave as it should. The West needed to use additional levers of pressure to induce Moscow to negotiate or to surrender its positions again. It seemed to me so, because Ukraine, perhaps, would have gone to negotiations. But this would be possible if support for Ukraine continued at the same level or even increased. Then Moscow would realize that resistance would become too expensive. But the West put on the brakes, and I remember well March-April 2023, and then until the NATO summit in Vilnius in July. The West has clearly expressed its position that it is impossible to put too much pressure on Russia, because this could lead to a chaotic process. In Washington, it was said that although Putin was an enemy, he could be predicted, and if he was eliminated, completely unpredictable figures could come. And in support of this position, on June 23 to 24, 2023, a march of justice between Prigozhin and the Wagner PMC took place. This strengthened them in the idea that under no circumstances should this structure be torn apart so that the power in Moscow crumbles and it becomes unpredictable who will possess nuclear weapons. It was the firm position of the Biden administration not to continue the increasing pressure. Only with the increasing pressure, which was achieved during the Kharkov operation and on the right bank of the Dnieper with the liberation of Kherson, it was possible to count on significant pressure. However, this did not happen. Therefore, most likely, it was not so much Ukraine that missed the moment, but the West was unable to mobilize additional resources so that this effect was converted into something more, because preparations for the counteroffensive have begun, and so, let's prepare. They were preparing through a stump deck, and the document turned out to be leaked. Now no one remembers how difficult it was for intelligence to help. A military man leaked it, and the help was coming, which means that Ukraine was not shaky or unstable. And this is such a problem that I would still share the responsibility with the leadership of Western countries for the fact that the negotiations did not begin and no attempts were made to agree on terms favorable to Ukraine.
Mark Zakharovich, it was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for answering.
Thank you, all the best.
Boris Pincus is with me today. Mr. Pincus, hello, I am glad to welcome you.
Good afternoon, dear. Thank you. Glad to be on your channel and glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes.
Of course, we will discuss the election race in the United States and its impact on Ukraine, but I can't help but start with Biden's possible withdrawal from this race. You have predicted this repeatedly, but I wonder if this was expected for Trump? After all, earlier his entire company was built against Biden. And if we take the results of polls and what they say in America in general, who has more chances now? Kamala Harris or Trump?
This is a very good question. Of course, I often said that Biden would get off, and so it happened. But he remains president until January 20th next year. This is 6 months, my friends. Every day is precious for Ukraine and for Israel. You know, today is the first day of the war in Ukraine, February 24, 2022, and Israel was in the same boat on October 7th last year. The united front line that links the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine is fueled by the main strategist and architect of these conflicts, Putin. And, unfortunately, the Biden administration is so sluggish, indecisive, not fixated on helping Ukraine win until it wins completely.
не зацикленная на оказании помощи победе Украины до полной ее победы.
And despite the passage of a law on April 20th of this year allocating $61 billion and a new law based on a new strategy to help Ukraine achieve its complete victory, this is still not happening, and that's the trouble.
Оказание помощи Украине до полной ее победы. Это не происходит по сей день. В этом вся беда.
And today, when Biden suddenly announces that he is withdrawing from the election race, but remains in office, the indecisive support for Ukraine with the constant condition not to escalate, not to provoke, not to pit the two nuclear powers against each other remains in force, as it has been since the first day of the war in Ukraine. That is, this is a mockery of Ukraine. This is sadism. When you see how you seem to help, you seem to pretend to help, and at the same time enjoy how the victim of the barbarians bleeds. You know, this is a crime. And what will happen, for example, if Harris wins? This question arises for everyone, and people are interested in how events will develop if she becomes president. What if Trump wins? And here you know what is the most frightening. The wave of those who are ready to bring Zelensky and Putin to the negotiating table is growing. This is the worst thing. And these conversations come from the mouths of great friends of Ukraine. The most obvious example is Boris Johnson, a great friend of Ukraine, there is no doubt about it. And suddenly, after the meeting, Trump comes out and says, "Here, it would be nice to freeze this front line on the date of February 24th, when Putin's aggression began." And in other words, leave these occupied territories until February 24th for Putin, and the rest for Ukraine, and continue to help Ukraine arm itself. I'm shocked, I'll tell you frankly, but for all that, you know, as they say, Plato is my friend, and the truth is dearer. There must be no concessions, my friends. If you give in, your finger will cut off your hand. If you give your hand, it will cut off your head. This is the law of the type of terrorists that Putin is. No way. You know, I don't believe that Trump will go like this. For many reasons. First, while Trump's choice of Vice President Vance was frightening, it is important to note that Vance was opposed to helping Ukraine. He is one of the top senators in Congress who opposed the allocation of $61 billion. I'll tell you frankly, we're not happy about that. Absolutely not happy. We're the Reagan wing of Congress in America. More of us than they are, you know. More of us in the Republican Party, a lot more. And yet, there is good news. Just a few days ago, the same name said that the occupation of Ukraine is unacceptable for America. This is the expression he expressed. This is very important. That is, we have hope that he will change his mind, just as he has always changed. For example, in 2016, he called Trump a fascist. And yet, when asked how it is that you, Trump's elected vice president, show loyalty and devotion to him, although you used to call him a fascist, he replied, "Yes, Trump managed to convince me. I realized that Trump is different, he is right, and I stand on his side." That is, it speaks of a person's character, which can change. This is my reference to the fact that just a couple of days ago he said that, you see, the occupation of Ukraine is unacceptable. This says a lot. On the other hand, let me remind you, my friends, that vice presidents are usually not involved in foreign policy problems. Well, I'm excluding Dick Cheney under Bush. That's an exceptional case, but in general, the vice president's prerogatives are limited to domestic issues. Plus, Trump is an egoist, and he will not allow anyone to make decisions on external problems. He will decide everything himself. He's a decision maker. That's the most important thing. Plus, while Trump claims to be able to resolve this issue in 24 hours with a single call, I don't think he's going to go against bipartisan congressional unity.
Я не считаю, я надеюсь на это, что он пойдет против двухпартийного единства в Конгрессе.
First of all, those Republicans on whom he relies. And who is this? Mike Rogers, chairman of the Arms Committee, Mike McCall, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and Mike Turner, chairman of the Intelligence Committee. 3 Republicans who are the architects of a new strategy to help Ukraine until total victory and the allocation of $61 billion.
So, Trump is talking to them today.
I will tell you the good news. Despite the fact that he disobeyed us and did not elect Nikki Haley, a great friend of Ukraine, as vice president, the situation is still positive. And yet, the good news is that he has added Mike McCall, a great friend of Ukraine who has been to Ukraine, to the team of advisors. I have just mentioned his name as chairman of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. And the most interesting thing is Mike Pompeo. The same Pompeo who was once a congressman, then became director of the CIA, and for the past 4 years has been the only one from Trump's entourage who has worked with him for all 4 years as Secretary of State. He is a great friend of Ukraine. He was introduced into the list of advisors. This is what I emphasize. Trump's advisors. This is very important. Moreover, we continue to lobby with the fact that if Trump wins, I say, if, with a stretch. Why? Because there is not much certainty that Trump can win. I'll tell you why a little later. Now, we're lobbying for Trump to appoint Nikki Haley as Secretary of State and Mike Pompeo as National Security Advisor. Instead, the dunce Sullivan, who periodically pressures Biden to end the war in both Israel and Ukraine. So, we are lobbying and we have a chance. And now I will return to the realities. What is the ratio between Trump and Harris? Which of them can win? So, the choice of Trump, young, energetic, intelligent and educated, but still far from foreign policy problems, who does not understand that Ukraine protects our American national interests on distant borders, that Ukraine is America's bulletproof vest, that Putin hates not only Ukraine, but also America, and that Ukraine has stood in the way of these barbarians heading to Europe, and then to America.
На пути этих варваров, на пути направляющихся в Европу, а потом и в Америку.
That's what he doesn't know. He doesn't understand. This, of course, embarrassed us. It hit Trump's chances of winning. Why? I will repeat it again. The fact is that today it is impossible for anyone, neither Democrats nor Republicans, to win without the help of competing votes from other independents. Let me remind you, we have 42 million registered Democrats, 36 million Republicans and 32 million independents. So, today, more than ever, the votes of the independents will be decisive, on November 5th. So, Trump, by choosing Vance, unfortunately, did not give the independents the opportunity to make a decision in favor of Trump. This is the whole problem. Therefore, we again say with regret to Trump and his entourage, why did you not choose Nikki Haley? After all, it is she who prevails over Biden to this day. You can't imagine that Nikki Haley today prevails over Trump and Biden on a national scale by 17 to 25%.
I'm sorry, but The Atlantic reports that the nomination of Kamala Harris could completely change Trump's plans, and he may even consider changing his vice president to D. Vance. Can this really happen?
Well, to be honest, the host is a barrier. He will want to, he will do it. Unceremoniously. There is no doubt about it. The trouble is different. Will it want to? Therefore, we are putting pressure on him now. I'll tell you honestly, he will regret his choice. Very sorry. You understand, we are not just about some kind of personality. We are talking about the party. The party must win. We have a different strategy, different approaches. We are for the end of the war in Ukraine, the sooner the better, in favor of Ukraine. Do you understand me or not? We are in favor of Ukraine, as well as any other country fighting for freedom and democracy, to be able to defend its borders recognized by the world community. We must not set precedents and allow any maniac or thug who has gained access to nuclear weapons to blackmail and conquer other countries. If we let Putin do it today, China could do the same tomorrow, and Iran, which dreams of destroying Israel and Saudi Arabia, will do the same. Why not? Iran dreams of being a leader in the Islamic world. You see, many other things can be like a chain reaction around the world. Therefore, Trump must understand the responsibility that falls on him. I think he understands that. A small example for you. I am very glad that Zelensky spoke with him on the phone. They were both satisfied. Now what do? We are lobbying. With the fact that Trump went to Kyiv. Let him go. See Bucha, Irpin, Izyum. Let him see for himself.
Will he go to such cities? Or will he just come to Kyiv, talk to Zelensky and leave? Won't he want to watch this devastation?
No, if he comes, he will definitely visit these places. There is no doubt about it. We have such a program, we are pressing. And we want to. He won't go alone. I think our friends will go with him. These are McCall, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. Mike Thorner is also a very important figure. Sorry, calls come from Ukraine one after another. I just want to say that we expect him to go with Ukraine's friends in Congress. This is very important. If he goes, we put pressure on it. I think everything is going to this. He has no choice. He is beginning to realize today that with the arrival of Harris, his chances have diminished. Why? Because we will have another problem on our agenda on November 5th, which may even be decisive. This is a problem with abortion. The fact is that Trump is in favor of abortion bans being adopted at the state level. Moreover, he says that up to 15 weeks of pregnancy, women should have the right to terminate pregnancy. After 15 weeks, everything is as soon as the pulse appears, embryos and so on. It's immoral, it's against religion, and so on and so forth. But the trouble is that women's voices are very important in our country. To this day, most women are against Trump. But Nikki Haley has a more liberal position. She says, "My friends, I'm a woman, I'm having a daughter, and I support limits, you know, on women's limitless actions in terminating pregnancies at any stage." But by giving some restrictions, we must at the same time give a woman space so that she can have the right to choose, you know, whether to terminate the pregnancy or not. This is important. And this position gives millions of women the opportunity to support Nikki Haley. This is very important. Therefore, if he took it, vice presidents, he would automatically receive tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of women's votes in his favor. This would increase his chance of winning on November 5th. This is not yet the case. This is our whole problem. Therefore, the appearance of Harris, it is terrible for both Ukraine and Israel. Why for Ukraine? First of all, Harris is not even Biden. She is even worse than Biden. Why? If Biden is in favor of somehow balancing between the extreme radical right wing of the Democrats and the moderate Democrats who are in favor of helping Ukraine, then Harris is entirely on the side of the right, you know, radical progressives. That's the trouble. In other words, their goal is to stop the war in both Israel and Ukraine in order to come as a party of peace on November 5th. This is terrible. This is what scares us. Therefore, we are proud that the Republicans have a different platform, I mean the overwhelming majority, and at the same time we want to be sure that Trump will announce his position on Ukraine today, without getting off with general phrases, not to mention the fact that he will solve the fifth day with one call. We need specifics. This is what we expect from Trump today. Therefore, I return to the question of a possible visit by Trump to Ukraine. We really hope that he will go, and this will also help Trump understand who we are dealing with today and what Ukraine's role is in the future of America. This is what we are counting on today.
If we talk about Trump's visit to Ukraine, when do you think it can take place? Is it possible that this will be the time when the Democratic Party will gather for a convention to officially announce Kamala Harris as its candidate?
A very difficult question. Everything will depend on the reaction of different ethnic groups, especially African Americans and Latinos. This is very important, as is the opinion of independents. Today, many institutes conduct surveys. Calls come in every day, including to me and, I'm sure, to others too. Thus, polls will show the vector of movement of Trump's popularity in our country. Of course, he will be terribly busy. August 19th is the first day of the Democratic Convention. By this time, they must determine, first, their vice president. And they are also dizzy for this position. They do not know who to stop at. On the other hand, there are many opponents against Harris in the Democratic Party itself. They say she's not the kind of person who reflects the majority of Democrats. That's what they say. That is, within the Democratic Party. Now that's interesting. In other words, the turbulence is terrible. Not only inter-party, but also within each of the parties. As I said, among the moderates and progressives within the Democratic Party and here, between the Reagan wing and the radical conservative wing. True, there are much fewer of them than of us. And yet, Trump today has yet to speak openly about how he intends to solve global problems, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. But I have no doubt about one thing. He will not be able to go against the will of the American people. The good news is that just a couple of days ago, a little-known, however, institute was announced. Eto Pew Research Center, ni Rasmussen ni Gallup, Naprima. A little-known institute conducted polls and says that 70% of Americans today are in favor of rigorously helping Ukraine until complete victory. A couple of months ago it was 62, today it is 70. On the one hand, and on the other hand, do you think Trump will go against the will of bipartisan unity in Congress, which supports helping Ukraine to complete victory? This cannot be. It is excluded. He will not have any support from us. We will simply condemn him, because Ukraine and Israel are unthinkable problems that must be solved in favor of the peoples of these countries. No aggressors, no terrorists. This is our agenda today. Therefore, my friends, I understand that the Ukrainian people are very worried. Moreover, there are contradictory reports from Trump's entourage, especially with the appearance of Harris, who may be nominated at the convention as the candidate of the Democratic Party, but, unfortunately, does not stand out for her political experience and, frankly, her horizons. To this day, she has not expressed her clear vision on the issue of testimony of aid to Ukraine.
Time writes that Trump is likely to reduce aid to Ukraine, forcing Zelensky to agree to peace agreements that are heavily skewed in favor of Russia. As a result, the first 8 or 10 months and, in fact, the whole of 2025 will be very difficult, the Ukrainian official said. At the same time, Ukraine often counts on the help of its allies in Europe, as well as on the US military-industrial complex, which can make huge profits from continuing to produce weapons for Ukraine. Well, we understand that if Trump comes, he will be in office for 4 years. But what are the guarantees that after this period, Putin will not start a war again? Well, that is, will Trump take Ukraine into NATO?
First of all, I do not believe, and not only me, but many of us, that Trump will agree to this. Any concession to Putin is a concession to America and a defeat for America, an admission of defeat. What does it mean? The 54 countries that make up the American-led Ramstein contact group can't beat one charlatan. Tell me, then why live in this world? What the hell is such greatness, self-praise? We're the same, we're in space. Well, tell me, where is justice? Who to believe? How much can this hypocrisy go off the scale? I don't think Trump can do that. He is a different type of person. Believe me, it can't be like that. If we give in to Putin, then we are yielding to China automatically. China is no less terrible and evil of tomorrow than today's Putin. There will just be a chain reaction. Understand, this is not only about Putin. Putin is one of the links in the chain, the axis that is clearly being formed today. These are Putin, North Korea, China, Iran. This is such a chain. And today, if we do not besiege Putin, Trump does not do it, then this chain will grow. All this is the beginning of the fall of America with all the ensuing consequences. Therefore, I rule it out. As for NATO membership, my friends, I, for one, believe that despite the fact that NATO today is an organization that has long been in need of reforms, and this takes time, we need to focus on ensuring that the mutual assistance and security agreement signed by Zelensky and Biden at the G7 in Italy is adopted at the legislative level in America.
На G7 в Италии, оно еще не принято на законодательном уровне в Америке.
We need this to be implemented at the legislative level at any cost. Then it will become law. Then it will not depend on any president who will be in the White House tomorrow. The law has been passed, and it must be observed. Just like America is helping Israel. Regardless of whether the Likud conservatives or the liberals led by the local terrible parties, who are ready to go to any lengths to lose the values for which Israel was created, it is the same with Ukraine. Therefore, my friends, remember, today you need to strike because it is more accessible. That is, Congress. Given that Republicans now have a majority in the House of Representatives, and that Democrats generally have no reason to worry, there is no reason to worry that much will change with Trump in the White House. And we began to talk about the need to include Ukraine in NATO. I believe, and I will repeat my thought, that given the bureaucratic nature of NATO and the need to reform it, we should focus on the fact that the agreement on mutual assistance and security between Ukraine and America, signed by Zelensky at the G7 summit in Italy, is ratified at the legislative level. Then we will have no fear that America will not help Ukraine. On the contrary, it should be done as soon as possible, the better. Moreover, both in the lower house of Congress and in the upper house in the Senate, there is bipartisan unity on the need to provide assistance to Ukraine. We need to promote it. The sooner the better. And that would be great. We wouldn't have any problems in the future. Who will come to the White House, how he will make a decision, testimony of assistance to Ukraine. No problem. The same is true of the relationship between Israel and America. America always helps Israel, regardless of who is at the helm of this state.
Boris Yakovlevich, thank you very much for this conversation, for finding time for our broadcast. I wish you a good day and thank you again for supporting Ukraine.
Thank you very much, dear ones. And glory to Ukraine. We will win. We have no other.